The road to Sundown Mesa gives out entirely 9 miles past the last real town, and Clara Bennett rides the final stretch alone, her horse picking a careful path through scrub, gone brittle with autumn. She had not expected to be here. 6 months ago, she had a husband in a small rented house in Denver and a life that felt, if not remarkable, at least settled. Now, she has a deed to a ranch she has never laid eyes on, inherited through a chain of relations who wanted no part of it themselves, and $7 worth of curiosity about why land this size could possibly cost so little. The county clerk had not been encouraging. He had looked up from his ledger only long enough to ask if she was quite certain, and when she said she was, he had simply shrugged and stamped the paper, the particular shrug of a man who has already decided a customer's regrets are not his business to prevent. Cresting the final rise, she sees the ranch laid out below her, a modest house, a barn, a scatter of outbuildings, and at the far edge of the property, near a stand of dry cottonwoods, a single low mound of earth, marked by a plain wooden cross, with no name carved into it at all. She notices it, mostly because there is so little else on the land to draw the eye. She does not yet know that she will come to know that small patch of ground far better than she would ever choose to. The house holds 11 years of dust, the way a held breath holds air, perfectly still, perfectly undisturbed, waiting. Clara lets herself in through an unlocked door and finds furniture still arranged for daily use, a stove holding a bed of long dead coals beneath a fine gray coat of ash, and clothing still hanging in a wardrobe upstairs, as though its owners meant to return within the hour. She moves through the rooms slowly, cataloging what she finds without yet letting herself think too hard about what it means. Whoever lived here did not pack, did not sell off their belongings before moving toward better prospects, as any family fleeing failed land would surely do. She spends the afternoon airing out the staleness, hauling water from a well that still runs sweet, despite the years of neglect, coaxing warmth back into rooms that have held only cold for over a decade. By evening, she has convinced herself that the discomfort settling in her chest is simply the discomfort any woman would feel moving alone into an unfamiliar house. Nothing more particular than that. She eats a quiet supper, telling herself firmly that the grave at the property's edge means nothing at all. Some forgotten traveler laid to rest by a family long since moved on. Nothing stranger than that. She does not yet know the family's name, or the dead man's either. She will not learn either for some time yet. In the morning she walks out to the grave before she has even started her chores, drawn by something she cannot fully name. The mound of earth looks, in the gray dawn light, exactly as fresh as it must have looked the day it was dug, the soil dark and loosely turned, rather than settled flat and hard the way 11 years of rain and wind should have left it. She kneels and presses her palm to the dirt, finding it soft, almost recently worked, with none of the compacted firmness a truly old grave ought to have. She tells herself this must simply be the particular quality of the soil here, sandy and quick to shift with any strong wind, and returns to the house to begin the real business of settling in, though she finds herself, throughout that first full day, glancing back toward the cottonwoods more often than any ordinary curiosity should require. She wakes near midnight to a sound she cannot place at first, a low, dragging scrape, distant and rhythmic, coming from somewhere near the property's edge. She lies rigid in the dark a long while, telling herself it must be some animal working at loose brush, though the sound holds a strange evenness that no animal's foraging ever quite achieves. She does not go to investigate that first night. She lies awake instead until the sound fades, sometime after 1 in the morning, leaving the house in a silence so complete it seems to carry weight of its own. In the flat gray light of the following morning, walking out to the grave once more before breakfast, she finds the soil disturbed even further than the day before, turned loose and dark in patches, as though someone had spent the night working the ground with a spade, though no tool marks, no boot prints, nothing at all marks the surrounding dirt to explain how such work could have been done unseen and unheard beyond that single, distant scraping sound. She spends the third day walking the full boundary of the property on foot, partly out of simple diligence toward land she now owns outright, and partly, she admits to herself only reluctantly, because she cannot make herself stay too long within sight of the cottonwoods without finding some excuse to look away toward other business. The fences are in poor repair in places, the barn roof wants mending before winter sets in fully, and the well, at least, proves better than she had any right to hope for, drawing clear and cold from deep enough that even a decade of neglect could not spoil it. She finds, walking the eastern boundary, the remains of what must once have been a second, smaller house, collapsed now to little more than a foundation and a few charred timbers, and she wonders, standing over it, whether it burned by accident or by some deliberate hand, and whether that fire had anything at all to do with the family that once lived here before disappearing so completely. She finds no answer in the charred wood itself, only more questions to add to the growing list she has not yet begun to write down. Thomas Rourke rides up mid-morning of her fourth day, well before she has met another living soul in the territory besides the county clerk. He is foreman at the larkspur spread 3 miles east, his skin weathered dark by sun, his hair a plain, unremarkable light brown, beneath a hat gone soft with wear. He sits his horse at the yard's edge a long moment before dismounting, his gaze drifting more than once toward the cottonwoods at the property's edge. "You bought Sundown Mesa," he says, when she comes out to meet him. Not quite a question. "I did. Didn't figure anyone would, not with what's out past those trees." He says it plainly, without unkindness, though something in his tone makes her spine straighten before he has said anything more specific. She invites him to water his horse, partly to be neighborly, and partly to buy herself a moment, to decide how much to tell him. He accepts, and while the horse drinks, he asks her, careful as a man testing ice, whether she has noticed anything unusual about the grave near the trees. She considers lying. She does not. "The ground keeps turning itself over," she says, "every single night, and no marks in the dirt around it to explain how." Something crosses his face at that. Not surprise exactly, more like confirmation of something he had hoped he was wrong about. He does not explain it further. He only tells her before riding out that Larkspur is close enough to reach on horseback inside 20 minutes, should she ever need to. He does not say what kind of need he has in mind. That night, curiosity finally overcoming caution, Clara forces herself to walk toward the sound rather than simply listen from the house. She carries a lamp, its small circle of light trembling ahead of her, across ground gone cold and silver under a clear, moonless sky. The dragging, scraping sound continues steadily as she approaches, growing no louder, seeming almost to pause and wait as her lamplight draws nearer the cottonwoods, until by the time she reaches the grave itself, it has fallen entirely silent, the soil beneath her lamp's glow lying still and undisturbed on the surface, exactly as it appeared the previous morning. She stands there a long while, waiting for the sound to resume, but it stays hushed the entire time she remains close, as though it knows precisely how near she has come and has chosen, for now, to wait her out. turning to walk back toward the house. At last, disappointed and unsettled in equal measure, her lamplight catches something new in the frost-hardened ground. Several yards from the grave, a single, small, bare footprint, its edges crisp in the cold dirt, with no trail of any kind leading toward it or away from it in any direction her lamp can reach. She kneels beside it a long while in the cold, unable to look away, understanding without yet being able to explain it that whatever disturbs the grave each night and whatever left this footprint are, in some fashion, she cannot name, the very same thing. Silas Vane arrives on the 9th day in a fine covered carriage that seems entirely too clean for the road it has traveled, drawn by 2 matched horses, driven by a silent man who never once looks toward the house. Vane himself steps down in an immaculate dark suit unmarked by dust and introduces himself with the easy, practiced courtesy of a man accustomed to being welcomed wherever he arrives. Owner of the Vane Railroad Company, he tells her as though the title alone should explain both his presence and his confidence. He admires the property with evident sincerity. Remarks on the good lay of the land for grading, and mentions, almost as an afterthought, that his surveys indicate Sundown Mesa sits directly along the most efficient route for a planned rail spur his company intends to build within the year. He names a figure considerably beyond what $7 might reasonably be expected to grow into. Clara tells him she is not selling. Not this soon. Not before she has given the ranch a fair chance to prove itself. Vane's smile does not falter in the slightest. "Of course, Mrs. Bennett," he says, softly as ever. "Take whatever time you require. I find that land such as this has a way of making its own case, given patience." His gaze drifts, just briefly, toward the cottonwoods at the property's edge before he climbs back into his carriage without further comment. He leaves as unhurried as he arrived, and Clara stands in the yard a long moment afterward, uncertain why a man who never once raised his voice or made an explicit threat has left her hands cold and unsteady at her sides. She spends that evening turning his visit over in her mind more than she cares to admit, unsettled less by the offer itself, which she had half expected from the moment the county clerk warned her the land was cheap for a reason, and more by the particular ease with which he had mentioned the grave, without ever once mentioning it directly. A man interested only in the practical business of laying rail track, she reasons, has no cause to let his gaze linger on a stranger's forgotten burial plot the way his had, however briefly, however carefully disguised as simple appreciation for the scenery. She writes nothing of this suspicion down yet, having not yet begun her ledger in earnest, but she carries it with her nonetheless, a small, persistent unease that sits alongside the larger unease already growing at the edge of her property. The following days pass with deceptive ordinariness, chores filling her hours from dawn until dusk, the physical exhaustion of ranch work leaving her, for the first time since her husband's death, too tired most nights to lie awake, dwelling on grief the way she once had in her rented rooms back in Denver. She begins to almost believe, in these quieter daylight hours, that she might yet build an ordinary life here, that the grave and its nightly disturbance might prove, given enough time, no more than a strange feature of the land to be quietly tolerated rather than actively feared, the way any long-time rancher learns to tolerate a stubborn well or an unreliable stretch of fence. It is a belief that will not survive what comes next. The small herd of cattle she has had driven up from town lasts less than a week before trouble finds them. She wakes on the fifth night to a commotion unlike anything she has yet heard on the property. Hooves pounding rails, a chorus of low, panicked bawling that pulls her from bed and into the yard with a lamp before she is fully dressed. She finds the corral in chaos, the animals pressed as far from the cottonwoods as the enclosure allows, eyes white-rimmed with fear, refusing to come near even for her. She walks the perimeter with her lamp raised and finds nothing to account for it. No predator, no snake, nothing beyond the ordinary shapes of night stretching away toward the grave itself. In the morning, examining the ground in full daylight, she finds fresh, bare footprints pressed into the dirt just inside the corral fence, pointed toward where the terrified cattle had huddled. The same small, crisp, trailless prints she found near the grave days before, appearing here now as though whatever leaves them has begun to range beyond its original patch of ground. Word travels quickly between a few ranches this far out, and Thomas hears of the spooked cattle before Clara ever brings herself to say anything. He rides over that same evening and goes straight to the corral, crouching at the fence rail to examine it with careful attention. Nothing broke here, he says finally, but they were pushed hard against it from the inside. Something scared them bad, and it was not anything with 4 legs or fur, or there would be tracks besides those. He nods toward the small, bare footprints still visible near the fence. Clara tells him, finally, about the grave, the nightly turning of the soil, the print she found there the same night this one appeared. Thomas listens without interrupting, his expression carefully still, and when she finishes, he is quiet long enough that she asks him outright whether he knows something about this land he has not told her. "I know what most folks around here know," he says slowly, "which is not much, but is not nothing either. There is an old man keeps the county cemetery, name of Eli Sharp. Been there longer than anyone. You ought to talk to him. Not me. I was not here for any of it." Vane returns before she manages to seek out Eli Sharp, arriving this time on horseback alone, but for his usual silent driver, trailing at a respectful distance. He finds her mending the corral fence herself and watches her work a moment before speaking, as though her labor only confirms something he had already assumed. "I hear you have had some trouble with your stock," he says, gently as always. "A shame. This is difficult country for anyone unfamiliar with its particular history." He lets the word particular sit there a moment longer than comfort allows. Clara asks him plainly what exactly he means by that. Only that ranching tests everyone equally, he says, spreading his hands in a gesture of perfect reasonableness. Harder still, perhaps, for a woman new to the territory, on land with something of a history buried within it. He renews his offer, generously, and she refuses him again flatly this time, and something briefly tightens behind his composed expression before smoothing back into its usual calm. "As you wish," he says. "I am a patient man, Mrs. Bennett." He pauses before turning to go. "You should know, purely as information, that my company employs a great many hands who travel these roads at all hours in the course of their work. Should you notice riders near your property after dark, I would ask you not to be alarmed. They mean you no trouble whatsoever." That night, for the first time, Clara sees riders of her own. 3 horsemen moving slow and deliberate along the road beyond her property line, circling without ever quite crossing onto her land, visible by moonlight from her window well past midnight. She cannot make out their faces. She does not need to, understanding immediately whose hands they must be. In the morning she finds the corral gate standing open, unlatched rather than broken, the small herd scattered nearly to the tree line by the time she discovers it. It takes the better part of the day, with Thomas's help once he arrives, to gather the animals back within the repaired fence. Latch did not fail itself, Thomas says, examining it closely. Someone worked this open, deliberate. Clara tells him about the riders, and his expression darkens in a controlled way she has not seen from him before. Not fear, but a quiet, simmering anger held carefully in check. Vane does not do his own dirty work, he says, but he has no shortage of men willing to do quiet favors for what he pays. He looks toward the cottonwoods, toward the grave itself. Doesn't mean everything happening out here is his doing, though. Some of it is not his to claim at all. Clara begins keeping a careful record after that. A plain ledger bought on her next trip to town, its pages filled with dates, hours, and precise descriptions of everything she cannot otherwise account for. The soil at the grave turned fresh each and every night without fail, the footprints appearing without trail at the grave, then at the corral, then once, disturbingly, on her own porch steps. The riders at the property line, 3 of them, always at night, never quite crossing onto her land. She begins noticing smaller disturbances too. A door she was certain she had latched, found standing open at dawn. And once, unaccountably, one of the dead man's few remaining possessions, a rusted pocket watch left behind in a drawer in the house, found sitting instead atop the kitchen table. Though she is certain she never moved it there herself, she writes it all down, less because she expects the record to prove anything to anyone else, and more because the act of writing steadies her, turning the shapeless dread of her nights into something with dates and margins, something small enough to close inside a book and set upon a shelf until morning. She resolves, closing the ledger on the 12th night, to ride out and find Eli Sharpie before the week is through, certain now that whatever answers exist for Sundown Mesa are old ones, far older than Vane and his offers. Eli Sharp lives in a small caretaker's cottage beside the county cemetery, close enough that Clara rides in alone the following morning, ledger tucked beneath her arm. He is older than she expected, perhaps 80, his hands marked by decades of grave-digging work, his eyes pale but sharp with a clarity that suggests he has never once stopped thinking about whatever brought her to his door. He does not seem surprised by the visit. Sundown Mesa, he says, before she has finished introducing herself, knew somebody would take it eventually. Good land, whatever else lies buried in it. For a long moment he says nothing further, studying her face as though searching it for the same fear he must once have seen in someone else's a very long time ago. You've seen the grave turn itself over, he says finally. It is not a question. Every night, Clara admits, and I found footprints I cannot explain, at the grave and elsewhere besides. Eli nods slowly, as though this only confirms something long since settled in his own mind. Bare feet, he says, start nowhere, end nowhere. Clara's breath catches at hearing her own private observation, spoken back to her so precisely. How do you know that? She asks. Because I dug that grave myself, Eli says, 11 years ago, and I've spent every year since hoping to God nobody would ever have cause to ask me about it again. The man in that grave came through town alone in the autumn of 1874, Eli explains, a stranger nobody in the territory could place, traveling with no papers, no name anyone could confirm, and precious little conversation to offer about where he had come from or where he meant to go. He took sick within days of arriving, some fever the town doctor could never properly name, and died within the week, buried out at what was then a working ranch. simply because the family occupying it, the Merricks, offered the ground rather than see a stranger left unburied entirely. I dug that grave myself, Eli says, same as I dug every grave in this county back then. Nothing strange about the digging. The strange part came after, the night we buried him, Eli continues. I rode past the property near midnight on my way home, force of habit, checking my work was sound, and I could have swear to this day, in fact, that the grave I had filled not 6 hours before stood open again, empty, the dirt piled neat beside it, exactly as it had been before I ever closed it. I told myself I was tired, seeing things by moonlight that were not there, rode home and said nothing to a soul. 3 weeks later, Eli says, his voice going thin, the whole Merrick family was gone from that ranch, vanished entirely, same as the story goes about places like this. Left the house standing exactly as they lived in it, and left out past where that grave sits. Footprints in the dirt, same as you found yourself, that start clear as day and stop just as clear, like whoever made them simply stopped existing mid-stride. Eli pauses a long while before continuing, his gnarled hands wrapped tight around his own cooling cup of coffee, as though the telling costs him something even after so many years of carrying it alone. There is more to it, he says finally, that I have never told a living soul, not even the men who dug alongside me in later years. The stranger, before the fever took him fully, spoke a handful of words to the doctor tending him, words the doctor himself found strange enough to repeat to me afterward, though neither of us made much sense of them at the time. He said he was not the first to travel this particular stretch of road looking for something buried nearby, and that he did not intend to be the last either. The doctor took it for fever talk, the ordinary nonsense of a dying man's mind, wandering loose, and perhaps it was nothing more than that. But I have wondered, all these years since, whether that stranger came to this territory already knowing something about this ground that none of the rest of us had any cause to know, and whether whatever he was searching for found him first, before he ever had the chance to finish looking. Clara asks the question she has been circling since Eli began speaking, whether anyone ever learned who the stranger truly was, or why his burial alone, of all the graves Eli has dug in a long career, should have produced such trouble. Eli shakes his head slowly. Never learned his name, he says. Never learned where he was bound, or what he might have been fleeing when that fever caught up with him. Only thing I know for certain, saying it now after all these years, is that whatever walked away from that grave the night I saw it standing open, it never once stayed put after, and it never once let that ground rest easy for anyone fool enough to build a life too close beside it. He warns her then more directly than he has warned her of anything else that morning, that she ought to leave that ground be whatever the nightly disturbance costs her in sleep. Whatever rose from that grave once, 11 years past, remains close to it still, patient, entirely capable of unsettling anyone determined enough or desperate enough to disturb it further. Clara thanks him and rides home in a silence she does not try to fill, already turning over, in her own private way, whether she can bring herself to heed that warning for as long as she remains at Sundown Mesa. That night, alone again at the ranch, Clara adds Eli's account to her ledger in full. The unnamed stranger, the grave that would not stay closed even on the very night it was dug, the Merrick family's disappearance not long after, the 11 years of silence that followed. She finds herself, for the first time since her arrival, less frightened than resolved. A haunting without history is a thing simply to endure or flee. A haunting with history, a specific patch of ground, a specific unnamed grave disturbed from its very first night, is a thing that might, conceivably, be understood, even if it can never be undone. She does not yet know what she intends to do with this understanding. She knows only that she cannot spend the remainder of her life waking each dawn to check the same patch of soil, waiting for whatever rose from that ground once to decide her fate in turn. The soil turns that night exactly as it always has, and for the first time, she does not walk out to check it before morning, choosing instead to simply lie awake and listen to the same low, dragging scrape rise and fall in the dark, wondering whether its rhythm carries some meaning she has simply lacked the patience to decode. She rides out 3 days later to the grave itself in full daylight, Thomas beside her at her own insistence, both of them uneasy despite the plain sun around them. The ground near the cottonwood shows no obvious disturbance in daylight, the soil settled and ordinary looking, and yet both horses grow reluctant well short of the trees, ears pinned, refusing to be urged any closer, forcing both riders to dismount and continue on foot alone. Kneeling at the grave's edge, Clara notices for the first time a faint, cool breath of air rising from the soil itself, something neither of them can account for by any ordinary explanation. The same unsettling exhalation Eli described feeling, he told her, on certain nights when he still rode close enough to notice it. County never touched this ground after the burial, Thomas says quietly, straightening, no reason to. Officially, nobody ever proved a thing was wrong with it. Doesn't mean nothing's wrong with it, though. Neither of them moves closer to the mound itself. Some instinct older than reason keeps them both a careful distance back, and for once neither is inclined to argue with it, standing together in silence a long while before finally turning back toward their waiting horses. On the ride back, Thomas asks her, carefully, whether she has ever considered simply leaving the grave to whatever business it seems intent on conducting each night, rather than continuing to press for an explanation that may never come. Clara considers the question seriously before answering. I have thought of it, she admits, but leaving it be has not stopped it from disturbing my herd or walking as far as my own porch some nights. Whatever this is, it does not seem inclined to stay confined to its own small patch of ground simply because I choose not to look at it too closely. Thomas has no answer for that, and they ride the rest of the way back in a silence that has become, over the weeks, less uncomfortable between them than it once was. The particular ease of two people who have stopped meeting every silence filled that evening, going through the dead man's few remaining possessions left behind in the house by whichever family occupied it after his burial. Clara finds, tucked in the back of a drawer she had not yet fully emptied, a small folded scrap of paper bearing a few words in a hand she does not recognize, faded merely past legible after so many years. She can make out only fragments, a partial date, and a single phrase repeated twice as though the writer meant to be certain it would not be forgotten. Does not stay down. She adds the scrap to her ledger without fully understanding what it might mean, though she suspects, closing the book that night, that she has just found the closest thing to a written record anyone besides Eli Sharp ever thought to leave behind concerning Sundown Mesa's stranger. Vane's men grow bolder in the days that follow, emboldened, it seems, by whatever fear the ranch itself already provides them to work alongside, rather than compete against. Clara catches one outright on the 16th night, a rider dismounted near her well, tools in hand, tampering with the pump mechanism under cover of darkness, and only her own sleeplessness lets her catch him at it. Lamp raised, ordering him off her land in a voice steadier than she feels. He flees before she can make out his face clearly, leaving behind a dropped tool stamped plainly with the mark of the Vane Railroad Company's equipment depot, evidence concrete enough that even a sympathetic judge could not easily wave it aside. She rides to Thomas the following morning with the tool in hand, and together they agree it is time to act on the human threat directly, whatever remains unresolved about the other. Thomas knows an honest deputy in town, unlikely to be swayed by Vane's considerable influence over the rest of the county's affairs. She rides in herself 2 days later, tool in her saddlebag and ledger under her arm, prepared for the first time to lay out, carefully and specifically, the pattern of harassment she has endured since refusing Vane's offer, while remaining, by her own deliberate choice, entirely silent about the grave, the footprints, and the 11-year-old history behind them. That part of her account, she has decided, belongs to her alone, and would do her case no favors in a territorial courtroom. The deputy listens gravely to her account and examines the tool with plain interest, promising to look quietly into the matter without tipping Vane's hand that he is under any particular suspicion. Just yet, Vane does not take well to the quiet inquiries that follow, whatever discretion Clara and Thomas had hoped might buy them. He calls on her again within the week, and for the first time his composure shows the faintest crack, not anger exactly, never quite anger, but a colder, more precise version of his usual patience. "I understand there has been some unpleasantness," he says, seated uninvited at her own table. "Accusations against my company. I do hope you have not been hasty, Mrs. Bennett. Hasty accusations tend to complicate matters for everyone involved. I found your company's tool at my well," Clara says. "That is not an accusation. That is evidence." His smile thins, but holds. "Tools go missing from job sites constantly," he says smoothly. He rises to leave, smoothing his coat with unhurried precision. "I would ask you to consider whether pursuing this serves you well. This is difficult country for a woman alone, difficult country entirely, if certain of its older troubles are stirred up unwisely." His gaze drifts, briefly, unmistakably, toward the cottonwoods. "I would hate to see you lose more to this land than you already stand to." Clara cannot shake, in the days following Vane's visit, the sense that he knows something of the ranch's older history that unsettles her more than any threat he has spoken outright. She asks Eli, on a second visit made alone, whether the Vane Company or its predecessors had ever shown interest in Sundown Mesa before the Merrick family vanished. Eli's face darkens at the question, in a way Clara has not seen from him before. "Vane's uncle ran a survey outfit through this territory back then," he says slowly, "scouting rail routes decades before any track was ever laid. Came through the very same season that stranger took sick and died. I've wondered, some nights, whether it was pure chance that put a nameless traveler in that ground the very year a rail survey crew was scouting this exact route, or whether somebody saw an opportunity in a stranger's death that the rest of us were never meant to understand." Clara rides home, turning this over, the unsettling possibility that Vane's family, one generation removed, may have had some hand, however indirect, in the very burial that first disturbed Sundown Mesa's ground, making the nephew not merely an opportunist circling a haunted property, but something closer to an inheritor of whatever his own family first set in motion. The nights grow harder to endure as the investigation presses forward on both fronts at once. The soil turns without fail, the footprints keep their patient, trailless appearances, and one night, near 3 a.m, Clara wakes to find a dead man's pocket watch, the one she locked away in a drawer weeks before, sitting once more on the kitchen table, its cracked crystal face turned deliberately toward the window that looks out over the cottonwoods. She does not touch it again that night. The deputy's quiet investigation bears fruit at last a few nights later, word reaching Thomas that one of Vane's hands has been caught outright tampering with a neighboring ranch's water supply. Evidence enough, combined with the tool from Clara's own well, to build a case that even a wealthy man's lawyers will struggle to dismiss entirely. The hand, facing real charges, begins to talk, confirming what Clara and Thomas had already suspected, a deliberate campaign against Sundown Mesa specifically, meant to frighten her into selling at a fraction of the land's true worth. What he cannot explain, what visibly unsettles even him, is the grave itself. He will not admit to ever approaching the cottonwoods at night, describing an unwillingness that goes well beyond simple caution. The trial comes swiftly by the standards of territorial justice. Vane's wealth buys him better counsel than his own hired hand, but it cannot erase a company-stamped tool found at Clara's well, nor silence a man already facing separate charges of his own. Clara testifies herself, calm and precise, laying out the pattern of harassment in the same careful, dated fashion she has kept in her ledger since her 12th night at the ranch, saying nothing at all, still, of the grave or the footprints, or the stranger buried 11 years before. Vane sits through the proceedings with his usual unshaken composure, and it is only in the final moment, as the verdict is read against him, guilty of conspiracy to harass and intimidate, fined heavily and barred from further rail surveys in the county for a period of years, that his mask slips just once, just barely before smoothing back into practiced calm. He approaches her once more outside the courthouse, alone, his voice soft and measured as always. "You've won, Mrs. Bennett," he says. "I congratulate you, and I hope the land proves worth what it has cost you." His eyes hold hers a moment longer than comfort allows. "I do wonder whether you have considered that. I was never the whole of what troubles Sundown Mesa, only the part a courtroom can touch." He walks away without waiting for her answer, leaving her standing on the courthouse steps with a victory that feels, for the first time, exactly as incomplete as he clearly intended it to feel. Thomas finds her there a moment later, having stepped away briefly to settle the horses, and reads the trouble in her face before she says a single word about it. "You beat him fair," Thomas says, "whatever he meant by that parting shot. Don't let him take the win away from you after the fact." Clara nods, though the unease Vane, planted with his final words, follows her the rest of that day and well into the evening. A small, cold seed of doubt that she cannot quite convince herself is entirely unfounded, however much she wishes it were. The town itself treats her differently in the weeks following the verdict. She notices the wary curiosity that once greeted the woman who bought a cursed ranch for almost nothing slowly soften into something closer to respect, even admiration, in certain quarters. The general store owner begins greeting her by name rather than simply nodding at her custom. A woman she has never formally met stops her on the street one afternoon simply to say she is glad to see someone finally stand up to Vane's company, which has apparently troubled more than one family in the county over the years, in ways never quite provable enough to bring to court. Clara accepts these small kindnesses gratefully, even as she carries, beneath them, the private knowledge that her victory addresses only half of what troubles her land, and that the half left unaddressed shows no sign whatsoever of caring what any courtroom might decide. The weeks following Vane's conviction bring the first real peace Clara has known at Sundown Mesa. The riders vanish from the property line entirely. The well stands untampered every morning. The small herd grazes undisturbed by anything resembling deliberate human mischief. But the soil at the grave continues to turn each night exactly as before, unfailing, patient as the ground itself. Thomas stays on more nights than not by now, an arrangement neither of them has formally named, but both have quietly settled into. He no longer pretends the grave might have a mundane explanation waiting to be found. Neither does she. Both have come, in their own separate and private ways, to accept that Sundown Mesa Ranch will simply always disturb that patch of ground each midnight, whatever else changes about the lives lived within its fences. Clara writes, one evening, a final entry regarding the human conflict at Sundown Mesa, resolved. Beside it, in the same steady hand, she adds a second line regarding the other matter, the older matter, the matter no courtroom in the territory could ever be asked to rule upon, unresolved, and she suspects closing the ledger, unresolvable by any means available to her. Eli Sharpie passes quietly that winter in his sleep at the age of 81, and Clara rides to his modest funeral with Thomas at her side, feeling keenly the particular grief of losing the one person who had truly understood, from the beginning, exactly what she had purchased for $7 at the small gathering afterward. An old friend of Eli's tells Clara something he had apparently never shared even with his closest neighbors, that in his final years, unable to sleep some nights for thinking of that first strange burial, Eli had taken to riding out to the edge of Sundown Mesa himself, simply to confirm with his own eyes that the grave still turned exactly as it always had. Said it comforted him, strange as it sounds. The old friend tells Clara, said as long as it kept turning the very same way each night, no faster, no deeper, he figured whatever rose from that ground once was content just to mark its presence, not reaching any further than it already had. Worried more, he told me once, about the nights it might stop turning altogether, or start turning something new. Clara turns the words over for days afterward, realizing she has, without quite choosing to, come to measure her own nights the very same way. Thomas asks her to marry him on a clear evening in early spring, standing in the yard between the house and the distant cottonwoods, close enough to notice in the early hours before the ground's nightly disturbance typically begins. An unusual and almost deliberate feeling stillness from that direction. Clara says yes without hesitation, a certainty that surprises her less than she expected, given how carefully she has guarded herself since her first husband's death. They plan a small wedding at Sundown Mesa itself for the following month, a choice some in town quietly question, given the ranch's reputation, but one Clara insists upon without needing to explain herself further to anyone but Thomas. Before the wedding, she makes a decision she has turned over in her mind for weeks, hiring a stonemason from town to cut and set a heavy granite slab in some private hope that sheer weight and permanence might finally accomplish what 11 years of undisturbed dirt could not. The mason sets the slab over 3 days of careful work, a solid, seamless covering with no gap or crack anywhere along its edges, and Clara watches it settle into place with a feeling she cannot quite name, some private hope she has not admitted even to Thomas that stone, unlike soil, might simply refuse to be turned. The mason himself, an older craftsman named Deacon Frey with decades of headstone work behind him, comments more than once during the job on the peculiar quality of the ground beneath the grave, remarking that the soil compacts strangely under his tools, resisting in places where ordinary earth should give way easily, and yielding without resistance in other places where he expects to meet firm resistance instead. He says nothing more pointed than that, being a practical man uninterested in speculation beyond his trade. But Clara notices Thomas exchanging a brief, wordless glance with her each time Frey makes such an observation, both of them understanding, without needing to say so aloud, that the ground itself seems reluctant to be sealed in the manner they intend. On the final evening of the work, once Frey and his assistants have packed their tools and ridden back toward town, Clara stands alone beside the finished slab for a long while in the fading light, running her hand across its cool, smooth surface, feeling nothing beneath her palm but solid, unyielding stone, exactly as it should feel. She allows herself, standing there, the cautious beginning of a hope she has not permitted herself in months, that perhaps this simple practical solution, weight and permanence, rather than any deeper understanding, might finally accomplish what an entire year of investigation, courtroom testimony, and careful record-keeping never could. The wedding takes place on a warm evening in early spring, held in the yard between the house and the newly sealed grave, attended by a modest gathering of neighbors, the sympathetic deputy, and the handful of townsfolk who have, over the past year, come to see Clara Bennett less as the foolish woman who bought a troubled ranch for $7, and more as the steady woman who fought off a wealthy man's campaign of intimidation and won outright. The ceremony passes without incident, vows exchanged in the golden hour before full dark, laughter and modest celebration afterward around a fire built near enough to the house to keep the evening's chill at bay. For the first time since her arrival at Sundown Mesa, Clara allows herself, for a few hours at least, to simply be happy, a woman married again, to a good man, on land unquestionably, however strangely, her own. It is only as the last guests depart, well after dark, that she catches Thomas's eye across the quieting yard and reads in his expression the same thought sitting unspoken at the edge of her own mind all evening, that the granite slab has made no sound at all tonight, that the yard has stood in unbroken stillness through vows and celebration alike. The last guests take their leave a little past 10, wagons rattling off down the property road until the sound fades entirely and Sundown Mesa stands quiet beneath a clear, star-heavy sky. Clara and Thomas linger by the dying fire a while longer, speaking softly of small things before finally turning toward the house, his arm around her shoulders in the cooling night air. She glances toward the granite slab as they pass it in the moonlight, more from habit now than fear a full year of nights having taught her to check, however briefly, before turning in each evening. The stone sits exactly as the mason left it, solid, undisturbed, no different in the moonlight from any ordinary marker on any ordinary grave. Nothing sounds, nothing moves. The night holds its unusual, unbroken quiet, and Clara climbs the porch steps beside her new husband with something almost like hope taking cautious root in her chest. Hope that tonight might finally mark some quiet, unspoken turning point in the ranch's 11-year-old rhythm. They retire not long after, the house settling into the particular stillness of a home finally fully at rest. No lamp left burning through the night this time, for the first time in longer than Clara can easily recall, both of them trusting, however cautiously, in the evening's unbroken silence. So far, Clara drifts towards sleep slowly, allowing herself the rare comfort of believing that perhaps this is simply how it ends, not with dramatic confrontation, not with the mystery finally solved and named, but simply with sheer weight and permanence accomplishing what nothing else could, sealing away for good whatever has disturbed that patch of ground for 11 long years. She sleeps deeply, for the first time in longer than she can remember, held in the particular exhausted peace of a woman who has, after a long and difficult year, finally allowed herself to simply rest completely. The house around her stands silent. The yard beyond it stands silent. For hours, the only sounds at Sundown Mesa Ranch are the ordinary sounds of a working ranch at rest until sometime past midnight in the deepest hour of the night. That silence, very quietly, very gently, begins to end. Clara wakes alone in the dark, though she could not afterwards say precisely what woke her. No sound loud enough to startle, nothing so much as a single distinct noise at first, only a change in the quality of the silence itself, the particular shift in a room's air that tells a sleeping mind before the waking mind catches up that something has begun again. Thomas sleeps on beside her, undisturbed, his breathing even and deep, and for a moment she lies still in the dark, listening, uncertain whether she has truly woken to anything at all. Then it comes, faint, distant, unmistakable, the same low, dragging scrape she heard on her very first night at Sundown Mesa, rising now from the direction of the granite slab, soft and testing at first, as though something out there in the dark is only now beginning to stir after a full year, a full 11 years before that, of patient, unbroken habit. Clara sits up slowly in the dark, careful not to wake Thomas, and finds herself, after everything, the fear, the ledger, the courtroom, the wedding, just hours behind her, strangely, quietly calm. She has spent a year learning that this cannot be stopped, cannot be explained, cannot be sealed away with sheer weight of stone over old ground. She decided months ago that she can live beside it, sitting in the dark on her wedding night, listening to the sound rise fully. She finds that she meant it entirely. She rises quietly from the bed, careful not to disturb Thomas's sleep, and crosses to the window rather than the door this time, some instinct telling her that tonight she will only listen, not walk out to confront it as she once did in her earliest, more frightened weeks on this land. The yard beyond the glass lies washed in pale moonlight, the granite slab a pale shape against the darker cottonwoods beyond it, appearing from this distance exactly as solid and undisturbed as it did the moment the mason set it in place. But the sound carries plainly across the still night air, regardless, steady, and unmistakable. The same patient scraping she has heard for a full year now. The very sound Eli Sharp once wrote out simply to confirm with his own ears, finding in its very sameness a strange and specific comfort of his own. She watches for a long while, the moonlit yard perfectly still, but for that steady, invisible sound, no shape emerging anywhere near the grave, no footprint yet visible in the pale dust at this distance. Nothing to see at all, beyond the ordinary shape of an ordinary ranch at midnight, and yet the scraping continues, deliberate and undeniable, exactly as it always has been. She does not wake Thomas. She simply stands at the window in her nightclothes, listening to ground that moves from beneath solid, unbroken stone on the first night of her second marriage, and finds that after everything, the fear, the grief, the courtroom victory, the year of learning to live beside a question with no answer, she is no longer counting the minutes to measure her fear. She is simply listening now, the way one listens to any familiar, ordinary sound belonging entirely to the place she calls home. The sound fades after perhaps 10 minutes, exactly as it always fades, not stopping abruptly, but growing quieter by degrees until the yard settles back into full, ordinary silence. Clara remains at the window a while longer, watching for any final sign, but nothing appears, the yard holding its silence, as completely as if nothing at all had disturbed it. She returns to bed at last, sliding carefully beneath the quilt beside Thomas, who stirs briefly but does not fully wake. Morning comes clear and ordinary, sunlight pouring gold across the yard, exactly as it has every morning since her arrival. Clara rises before Thomas, dresses, and walks out past the cottonwoods before breakfast. For the first time in weeks, coffee forgotten in the house behind her. The granite slab sits exactly where the mason left it, seamless, unmoved, precisely as solid as the day it was set. She kneels beside it anyway, and finds, running her fingers along its very edge where stone meets soil, that the earth there lies loose and freshly turned, dark and soft exactly as it always has been, each morning since her very first day at Sundown Mesa, the stone above it entirely undisturbed, entirely impossibly no obstacle at all to whatever moves the ground each night beneath it. She stays kneeling there a long while in the gold morning light, saying nothing, deciding nothing, simply watching the dark, loose earth at the granite's edge, turning over in her mind the whole long year. That has brought her to this exact moment. The widow who arrived alone with a trunk and $7, the nights of counting and unexplained sound in the dark, the courtroom and its incomplete victory, the wedding and the small, fragile hope that a slab of stone might finally grant her land the peace it has been denied for 11 years running. She thinks of Eli Sharpie, riding out alone in his final years, simply to confirm the ground still moved exactly as it always had, finding some measure of comfort in that very saneness rather than any hope of an ending. She thinks she understands him now in a way she could not have a year ago, before Sundown Mesa taught her what it means to build a whole life directly beside a question that will never once answer itself. Thomas finds her there some minutes later, having woken to an empty bed and followed her tracks out past the cottonwoods, and he says nothing at first, simply kneeling beside her at the granite's edge to see for himself what she has already confirmed. He does not ask if the stone held. He can see plainly that it has, exactly as Frey the Mason left it, seamless and solid. He asks instead, quietly, whether she regrets any part of the choice she made in coming here, the ranch, the ledger, the year of nights that led them both to this exact patch of ground on the first morning of their marriage. Clara considers the question with the same careful honesty she has given every hard question this land has put to her over the past year. No, she says finally, whatever this is, it has never once tried to take anything from me that I was not willing to keep giving back in return. My fear at first, and now, simply, my attention. I think that may be